April 27th, 1945, Lower Bavaria, Germany. By the last week of April, we weren't fighting a war anymore. We were trying to survive the peace that hadn't arrived yet. The roads were clogged with carts that used to be kitchens, children wrapped in quilts that used to be curtains, and men who had run out of maps. The hills wore a wet spring green that felt almost insulting. It was the color of beginnings, and we were very busy with endings. Our unit had been a company once, then a platoon, then a rumor. We moved at night because the day had too many eyes. American patrols from the west, rumors of French armored cars on the highways, and shapes in the sky that watched even when the clouds pretended otherwise. At dawn, we slept in barns that still smelled of hay and September. By noon, we were marching again, counting steps because numbers were the only things that still obeyed us. I was 19 and went by Hans in quiet moments and Müller whenever someone needed blame. My boots had learned the exact shape of my feet, and my rifle had learned the exact weight of my doubt. We had a lieutenant who still believed in sentences with verbs like hold and counterattack. His name was Reiser, and he wore his cap at the precise angle the regulations preferred. He had a clean jaw, a clean pistol, and a clean belief in orders that had outlived the people who wrote them. We also had Otto. Before the war, Corporal Otto Kruger had borrowed jokes from beer halls and applause from strangers. He used to say Berlin taught him two things: how to find a stage and how to leave by the back door when the joke went wrong. He was taller than he needed to be and carried his height like a story. Even in uniform, he moved like a man who had once owned a tuxedo. He could make a cigarette look like a prop. The first time he told me he used to be funny, I believed him because there was a shape in his silence that only laughter leaves behind. We were 15 men, plus Reiser and Otto. We had one wagon, 3 horses, and a radio that had decided to retire without telling anyone. The news we got came from the mouths of farmers who had less than we did and gave us water anyway. Hitler was dead, said one. No, he had married his mistress, said another, which sounded like the same kind of ending. The Americans had crossed the Danube. The British danced in Hamburg. The Russians were a river with feet. The war was over everywhere except where we stood. On the morning of the 27th, our wagon broke an axle halfway up a forest road. The forest didn't care. The birds had started again, unafraid of engines, and a woodpecker went about his business like we were the ones making the noise. Reiser stood with his hands on his hips and performed an inspection that looked like prayer. Otto crouched beside the wheel, ran a hand along the splintered wood and said, "I can fix this if the wheel agrees to stop being broken." "That is not helpful, Kruger," Reiser said. "Sir, helpful would have been not losing the Eastern Front," Otto replied so mildly that even the insult sounded like a courtesy. We shouldered what we could. The wagon would have to learn to be a statue. We moved into the trees, the kind of thin Bavarian woods that let the sun through in broken coins. Every kilometer, Reiser stopped and stared at his map, as if it had disappointed him personally. He insisted we could still link up with a larger formation, still hold a sector, still be the part of the army that existed in sentences. The rest of us were trying to become prisoners before we became ghosts. Stay with me, I want to tell you here, because what happens next is where the road turns from fear to something stranger. By afternoon, the forest thinned and cracked into pasture, the kind that ripens in August and remembers it in April. A church spire rose beyond a hill like a finger to the sky, and near it a village lay quiet in a way that felt practiced. A woman in a blue shawl watched us from a doorway and folded back into the house as if we were weather. We moved in single file, rifles slung low, safety on by habit, muzzles pointed at the ground because we were tired of the sky. On the far side of the village, the road turned south into a shallow valley. At the bend stood a wooden shrine, the kind with a little carved Christ whose painted eyes had watched 100 winters. A hand-painted sign beneath him said, "Gott sieht alles." which was a lot to ask of a man nailed to wood. Someone had tucked primroses into the frame. For a second I hated the flowers for existing. We didn't see the Americans until they stood up. They were half hidden in a ditch at the foot of the hill, brown-green in a way that didn't come from any tree around here. Helmets like smooth bowls, rifles that looked like decisions. There were 8 of them, maybe 10, and they stepped onto the road as if they were part of it. A sergeant with a face that might have been kind in a different week lifted his hand, and the rifles rose with it, a small metal sunrise. "Drop it," he said. The English clipped and flat. We froze, the way rabbits do when they remember the word hawk. Reiser's hand hovered near his pistol. Otto lifted his palms before anyone told him to and let his rifle slide from his shoulder like a tired child. The rest of us followed the movement because gravity is contagious. "Hands up," the sergeant said. One of his men stepped forward to collect weapons, eyes flicking from our faces to our fingers. Another covered him, his mouth set in the kind of line that means math, distance, wind, the brief biography of a trigger pull. Reiser cleared his throat. "We are members of the 329th Battalion," he began in German, voice aiming for dignity and landing on dust. "We intend to—" "Speak English," the sergeant said. Otto spoke before Reiser could decide whether to be offended. "We speak fear," he said in English, clean enough to surprise everyone. "But fear has a good accent." A couple of the Americans flinched into half smiles. The sergeant did not. "Who's in charge?" Reiser lifted his chin. "I am." The sergeant's eyes moved to Otto. "Who's actually in charge?" Otto glanced at Reiser, then back at the American. He took a small breath. Later, I would understand that it was the inhale a man takes before stepping onto a stage where the floor might be a trapdoor. "Sergeant," he said, voice light, palms visible, "I'd like to surrender before anyone gets promoted for killing me." It was not a great joke. It was not even a good one, but it came shaped like mercy. There was a beat, and then the private covering us barked a laugh he tried to swallow. The man collecting rifles shook his head, a smile spilling out despite his orders to hold it back. The sergeant looked at Otto for a long second, and his face did something tired and human. He lowered his hand. The rifles didn't drop, but they tilted. "Fine," he said. "You boys got any surprises? Mines, grenades, hidden squads with itchy fingers?" Otto shook his head. "Only the lieutenant's optimism," he said. "It's very dangerous up close." Reiser stared at him with a kind of rage that comes from being made into a punchline by the truth. He tried again in English, stiff as a fence post. "We will comply with your instructions." "Good," the sergeant said. He flicked his eyes at me. "You, come forward, hands where I can see them." I went. He took my rifle and my knife, and the watch my uncle had given me before the war told time differently. He searched my pockets with the casual expertise of a man who had done it in 2 languages. He found a folded photograph of my mother and sister and handed it back without looking. "Keep that," he said. "It's yours." Then he looked at my face. "You kids are all the same age," he muttered. "Not to me." He waved us off the road, hands still raised, rifles at our backs, but no one's finger white on the trigger. We stood in the damp at the edge of the ditch and listened to the sound we had all forgotten we could make. Breathing that wasn't trying to be quiet. The sergeant spoke into a radio, words chewed by static, and then pointed us toward the hill. "Move," he said. "Slow." We climbed, not up to a gallows, but into a meadow that had been waiting all winter for anything but this. The grass dampened the sound of boots. A medic in an American armband counted us with a pencil and a distant look, as if he were inventorying tools. The sergeant pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, broke it into unfair pieces, and handed one to Otto. "For the line," he said, almost smiling now. "The funny one goes first." Otto saluted with 2 fingers and a mouth pretending not to grin. "See," he said to us in German. "Timing!" If this is the part where you think the story ends, stay with me. Surrender is not a curtain, it's an intermission where the lights don't come up. They marched us to a farmhouse used as a collecting point. The kitchen smelled like soap that had lost its fight. An American private with freckles counted our belts and stacked our boots by sizes that felt like jokes. We sat in our wool socks on a floor that had hosted dinners and childhoods and now held us like a patient parent. An officer arrived, a lieutenant with a lean face and the calm of someone too tired to be cruel. He spoke German like a man who had learned it from a neighbor, not a book. "We will ask questions," he said. "You will give answers. If you lie, we will find out. If you tell the truth, we will still verify. If you try to be clever, I will be cleverer. Understood?" We nodded because the alternative was to try cleverness on a day when it would not be appreciated. He took us one by one into the pantry, which had become an office by virtue of having a table. When it was Otto's turn, I pressed my ear to the door because I could not help myself. The lieutenant began with the list: unit, commander, last orders, last contact, any mines on the road, any explosives in the bridge. Otto answered cleanly, easily, as if truth were finally lighter to lift. Then the lieutenant said, "You're the one with the jokes." Otto sighed, a sound with 70 nights of marching in it. Better to make a joke than to be one. "You know why they laughed?" the lieutenant asked. Otto shrugged. "Because we were all waiting to find out whether our last words would be in English or German." The lieutenant paused. "Because you reminded them they weren't machines." He shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. "Why risk it?" "Because when a man points a gun at you," Otto said, "there are only 3 languages he understands: fear, bravado, and humor. I don't have enough bravado, and I'm tired of fear." A long moment, the lieutenant exhaled through his nose, which sounded like a man letting go of a little war inside himself. "You saved your men," he said. "Don't expect a medal." "Sergeant already gave me chocolate," Otto said. "I prefer that to metal." They kept us 2 days while columns moved and the front, if it still existed, slid north like a slow idea. We slept in the barn and woke to coffee that tasted like an apology. The Americans guarded us, but loosely, as if they had run out of suspicion the way we had run out of bullets. At night I watched the sky and listened for planes that didn't come. The silence felt like a thin sheet pulled over something big. On the 3rd morning they marched us to a larger camp. The roads stretched out, grey and patient. We passed a line of villages repairing a bridge with planks that remembered being trees. They didn't look at us. We were neither the heroes who had promised them things, nor the villains who had taken them. We were footnotes. At the gate, an American clerk took our names and wrote them down in a hand that made everything look gentler. He gave me a tag with a number and a blanket that smelled like other men's stories. When he got to Otto, he squinted at the letters. "Kruger," he said, giving the umlaut a try and missing it by a country mile. "Close enough," Otto said. The clerk hesitated. "You the comedian." Otto tilted his head. "I'm the man who wants to go to sleep without a helmet." "Line 3, the clerk said, but his mouth curved. "Don't make trouble." "Trouble is what I've been trying to surrender from," Otto said, and the clerk shook his head as if he were choosing not to like him. "Camp is a kind of country. It has its own borders and currency. The currency is information first, then cigarettes, then favors, then hope. We traded what we had. The Americans brought soup thick enough to remember the names of its ingredients. We brought civility, which was a luxury we had not been able to afford for years. We lined up for haircuts and medical checks and learned to answer roll call in a language that did not care how we felt about it. The days became squares on graph paper, filled with small numbers that added up to waiting. Otto told 1 joke a day, never more. He said rationing applied to laughter too. He stitched them from small observations, the absurdity of error, the way a boot sounds different when it knows it is no longer marching toward a line. He stood near the fence in the late afternoon when the light did that generous thing it does, and he would say something that made men remember how to swallow and breathe at the same time. He refused to perform. He simply allowed the air around him to be less heavy. That is its own profession. Stay with me, because even small mercies pay taxes. At the end of May, the rain came in a hard, stubborn sheet that couldn't decide when to stop. The ground turned to a kind of polite mud, the kind that gets on your boots and then pretends it wasn't invited. A cough began to move through our barracks, soft at first, then with more conviction. The doctor, an American with a face that apologized for having to make rules, told us to spread out, to keep blankets dry, to drink water that pretended to be tea. We nodded and continued to be 30 men in a space for 20. Otto's cough started as a punctuation mark and became, within a week, its own paragraph. He waved it away with the performance of a man who has waved many things away. He still went to the fence in the afternoons. He still broke the silence at the right time. But the laughs came with a sound afterward, a little thunder in the chest. The camp doctor noticed. "You," he said, wagging a stethoscope like a finger. "Bed, quiet. No audience." "I'm retired," Otto said, "from all professions." "It's not a request," the doctor said, and this time he made the sentence stick. We took turns sitting by Otto's bunk. He made us tell him jokes so he could rate them sternly. He told me mine were too reliant on adjectives. He asked Reiser, now a man without orders, to describe a map that led nowhere. To my surprise, Reiser did, and when he finished, his mouth had learned to be uncertain. One night when most of the camp had fallen into the heavy half-sleep of men who do not trust a roof, Otto beckoned me closer. His voice had gone sideways, like a radio station just beyond the ridge. "You know why I made that joke?" he asked. "The one in the road." "Because you're you," I said, which was lazy but true. He shook his head. "Because jokes go where uniforms can't. They're like truce flags you can hide in a sentence. You wave them and hope the other side knows the color." He closed his eyes and opened them again, because sleep had started to ask questions. "Promise me something," he said. "When you tell this story, don't make me a hero. Make me a man who was tired of dying in languages he didn't choose." "I promise," I said, and he nodded like a director saying, "One more take." By June, the cough had stolen enough of him that even standing looked like a magic trick. The doctor tried everything short of conjuring. In the end, Otto's body chose to rest in a way that did not require permission. He went quietly, as if exiting stage left while the band covered the sound. We buried him beyond the fence in a small square the Americans had set aside for secrets. A chaplain said words that made sense in two countries. The sergeant with the tired kindness took off his helmet and did not wipe the rain from his face. In the barracks that night, we passed the chocolate bar wrapper someone had saved from the afternoon on the road. We treated it like a relic because sometimes people need a physical thing to carry the weight memory cannot. Reiser held it last. He folded it smaller, then slid it into the pocket where his pistol had lived. He didn't say anything. He didn't have the language for apology yet. The war ended officially on a day the sky forgot to mark. Papers were signed in rooms with chandeliers. The newspapers called it capitulation and said the word like it had been waiting its turn to speak. In the camp, the guards were the same men, and the soup tasted the same, and the fence continued to be a line on a map that meant we still belonged to the side of not yet. We learned patience the way you learn a new alphabet, slowly, with mistakes, by tracing someone else's letters until your hand remembers. Month by month, they let us go in small groups like birds testing the wind. When my name came, the clerk who had missed the umlaut smiled a little. "Where to?" he asked, as if there were more than one answer. "Home," I said, "if it survived." He stamped the paper and handed it to me as if it were a ticket to a play that might be cancelled. try not to start any more wars," he said. "I'm a fan of endings now," I told him. I walked out with a blanket, a tin cup, and a story I didn't yet know how to tell. The road home was a mosaic of other people's houses. In the village where we'd surrendered, the shrine still watched. Someone had replaced the primroses. The sign still said, "God sees everything." I hoped he was editing. When I reached my town, it had learned to stand without its teeth. My mother had a line of grey in her hair that hadn't been there in the picture. My sister had grown into the kind of girl who can mend a sleeve while telling you what the mayor should have done. We sat at the table with a loaf of bread that had travelled fewer miles than we had, and I told them the short version. We met Americans. They didn't shoot. We didn't die. I didn't know how to explain that the punchline had been the only bridge anyone could throw across a chasm that day. Years later, when the world had put on its suit and pretended it had always been this polite, I was asked in a classroom what saved us. The students were kind. They had never held a rifle. They wanted an answer with a date and a statistic. I told them the truth that will never fit in a textbook, a joke, a sentence with soft edges spoken at the right moment. They laughed because that is what people do when they hear that laughter is more than noise. If this story has moved something in you, keep it. Humor does not cancel horror. It lets the human voice find a way through it without breaking. On that April afternoon, under a sky that didn't care, and in a country that was learning to care again, one man used the only weapon left that didn't wound anyone. They let us surrender. The laugh was small, but it was loud enough. And you, if you had stood on that road with rifles aimed and futures trembling, would you have risked a smile to save your life? Or would you have waited for permission that never comes?